Welcome everyone. My name is Dimitri Broxton, and this is part 3 of the Art History Crash Course with Jackie Francis. Um, I'll give everyone just a few minutes to log in and we will start. Yes, I know. My apologies for the echo. Okay, it looks like our number is stabilizing. Oh geez, this is still echoing. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be on 2 devices at one time. Uh, okay, thank you for joining us from Los Angeles. Just give me one more second. Okay, this is our third part of the Art History Crash Course with Dr. Jacqueline Francis. As a reminder, we are streaming to Facebook and we will also back this up to YouTube after each session. So if you miss anything, if you come late, you can always go back and watch those. This program is generously funded by IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services in Washington, D.C. So we thank IMLS. And we thank all of you who have generously made donations in support of this program. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Francis, and I will be here with chatting. So just as a friendly reminder, we do want folks to interact with us. So please chat. We see it and we will respond. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. All right, without further ado, Dr. Francis.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Wednesday, February 3rd. I know that some of you might have looked at the subject outline online. So we're one class behind. Next week, we'll do the Caribbean and performance aspect of the course, which will be our final meeting. Thanks so much for being here. So before we get started, I just wanted to, as always, kind of do a little grounding exercise to get us centered. If we could just take a minute and slow everything down, and maybe to help us get slowed down, if we could take anything that we might have in our hands out of our hands just for a moment, whether it's a pen or take your hands off your keyboard, as well as just put down any piece of paper or notebook in front of you. And I would suggest that you also close your eyes just for a minute in order to listen. I'm suggesting tonight that we'd be very keen to, hearing me, of course, hearing each other, and you'll hear some audio as well as music in some of the presentation tonight. So let's just take a minute and listen to silence, and silence can be very loud. Okay, we're coming back together. I'm opening up the chat just to see if people put anything in about the kind of things that they heard. Kind of sounds they heard maybe from outside of their bodies or from their own bodies. I was very aware of my earphones. Your kids, yep, great, cool. Traffic sounds outside, yeah, me too, Julie. Rush hour here in San Francisco. Yeah, the air through the heating vents, the soft sound of traffic outside. Yeah, cool. The kid that sounds like it's great, Darlene. Thank you. My cat eating dinner. Yeah, that's interesting when you hear them smacking away. Cool. So, one of the things that I wanted us to start thinking about to start off is um, I'm going to start off by mentioning a couple of texts, a couple of scholarly publications that came out in the 20th century. And I'm going to read from a couple of them. And of course, you'll see the names of the publications I'm talking about. Because I think these are kind of key interventions in this idea of defining diaspora, at least toward the latter part of the 20th century. We've talked about, the Black Atlantic and other words to talk about the historical movement of people from Africa into enslavement in Europe and in the Americas. Last week, we talked a little bit about the ways in which artists are or have been studying and defining diaspora for themselves to make artwork mostly for a gallery going and a museum going public. And we'll continue to start doing that as well. So yes, Dimitri, let's share the presentation. Great. So as I said, we'll talk about our performance and public performance, which is what Carnival is next week during our last meeting. Um, if we could go to the next slide, some of uh, the terms that you see here are terms not particular to scholars of art by African Americans or people of African descent, but I think it'll be interesting to hear how they are weighed into the discussion of the objects and the ideas that we talk about today. I also want us to think about the ways that some of these words are not just words for the academic or the intellectual sphere of art history and the study of the humanities, but how some of these writers that we're going to talk about, like Joseph Holloway, like Richard Price and Sidney Mintz, and certainly like Robert Farris Thompson, are activist scholars. And in that way, they follow in the footsteps of people that we talked about earlier in the crash course, like Zora Neale Hurston, Alan Lomax, who were both collecting stories and music from Black people in the American South. Remember that we talked about Catherine Dunham, who studied art as well as dance, especially across the Americas. We also mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as C.L.R. James, very much interested in the cultures of people of African descent. And in passing, we talked about, of course, Paul Gilroy and Frantz Fanon. So some of the keywords here for this week that you can see. I put activism there because I do think some of this scholarship has a sort of a political thrust to it. Aesthetic is always discussed when we talk about art and the sort of value of things that we think, or assessment of things that we think might be beautiful. Art history as a discipline, modernity and modernism, both connected, but in terms of art history, modernism has a sort of special niche that people arguably say begins in the 19th century. Narrative as storytelling, which can happen not only through words, but also in pictures. Postmodernism as the thing that, of course, would follow modernism postmodernism, and people think about postmodernism in the Western art sphere beginning sometime in the 1970s or at the very latest the 1980s. And then the genres of still life and the nude, which I'm sure some of you might be quite familiar with. So to start off, if we could go to the next slide. Thank you, Dimitri. And I'm also watching the chat as well. This publication by two self-identified anthropologists, and some of you may have feelings about that whole field, and certainly the people who spend their intellectual time and their intellectual labor in that field started thinking about in the 1970s. So Sidney Mintz was a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and Richard Price was one of the students. And, you know, looking at this book jacket blurb, and I have the book right here in front of me. I was just talking with Dimitri about getting books out of storage and finding things and going back to them, because I remember reading this book, The Birth of African American Culture and Anthropological Perspective, when I was in grad school. What these two authors are doing under the rubric of Black study and anthropology, if you looked at the back of this publication, you would see the subject heading as those two things. And what they're trying to do is to say that there's no single culture that enslaved Africans imported intact to the Americas. Instead, what they're arguing is that enslaved Africans forged a new culture with distinct institutions, religious beliefs, and kinships that were, and this process was happening even during the Middle Passage. So what they're doing is kind of taking on this argument that some in their field, amongst them, Robert Farris Thompson, who we're going to talk about in a second, would say is that there are things such as intact African survivals. And what Mintz and Price are arguing is that the whole notion of diaspora is to imagine that something is transformed by the process of flight, the process of scattering. Remember when we talked about that, the etymology of the term diaspora during the first class meeting, it's this idea of scattering, the scattering of people, almost like the scattering of seeds in a field. So if Thompson's idea, and we're going to talk about Robert Farris Thompson in a second, is about African survivals, people like Mintz and Price, and someone that I studied with, as a matter of fact, named David Brown, we're talking about looking at the resiliency of African diaspora cultures is something that is about innovations and transformations that have been brought about in the new context of the Americas, as well as to some extent by extension, Europe. So there are two terms that you might want to think about here, and I didn't add them to the key words, but some of you might have heard them before. One is essentialism, that there's something that is always at the essence of an identity, as opposed to constructionism. That is to say that identity is formed by the context in which we find ourselves. So Mintz and Price are definitely constructionist. My advisor, David Brown, was a constructionist, I'm thinking like a constructionist. If we can go to the next slide, Dimitri. So in terms of survivals, here's the publication by Joseph E. Holloway that I mentioned a couple of classes ago in terms of an anthology by this academic, Joseph Holloway, who still teaches at Cal State Northridge. And he comes from the field of history. And he's a professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at Northridge. And in this book, which is a collection of essays by contemporary scholars of history, of folklore, of religion, of language, of music, of aesthetics, Holloway is trying to make a point that the definition of American culture has to be expansive, to really speak about African influences and African diasporic culture in the Americas. And he does use the word of survivals. So let me answer a question here, I think, from Darlene in the chat. Are artists in the African diaspora, particularly writers, decidedly seen as significant, primarily if they are seen also as activists? I know this is an old debate in the US context, at least. Can we see the resiliences through the lens of activism? That's a really good point. Let's talk about it. I mean, it seems yes, no, maybe in the middle. When we think about the artists in the African diaspora, particularly writers, and I'm sure a lot of us are thinking about and seeing a lot of programming. Who are we thinking about? We could go back to Phyllis Wheatley. Remember, we talked about her early in this crash course in the first meeting. We could think about, Equiano. We could think about Ignacio Sancho. We could think about writers of the 19th century like Alexander Dumas, and we can think of 20th century writers, whether it's James Weldon Johnson or Paul Laurence Dunbar, or of course, moving into the mid 20th century, Richard Wright and James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. How do we see the ways in which their work is both working as art form, as literature that's nonfiction, but criticism or literary study, as well as activism? Maybe it's a big question that we can continue to sort of hold on to. So we see a variety of perspectives, maybe. In terms of the Holloway publication, I just wanted to note that you'll see, if you pick up this publication, I'm sure you can find it in a used bookstore, if not in your public library or your institutional library. The contributors include, as I mentioned, Robert Farris Thompson earlier. He writes about Congo influences in African American artistic culture. There's Molefi Asante, who's a very well-known academic. He was the founder of the PhD program in Africana Studies at Temple, where he still teaches. He writes about African elements in American English, in African American English. There's a historian named Margaret Washington Creel who talks about Gullah attitudes towards death. Some of us might be interested in this subject, having talked about and looked at, maybe some of us, the Daughters of the Dust movie, film by Julie Dash, which we talked about a little bit ago. And lastly, there's a historian of economics and law named John Edward Phillips, who talks about the African heritage of white America. So, these are things that are, in terms of topics, the different positions that the contributors here are offering. Think about this in 1990, and even the image that the publication is offering us on its cover, the ways in which the map of the United States, especially its southern tier, seems to be about something that has moved from the African continent onto the United States part of the Americas. So an argument being made that not only are African American people not seen and seen as full citizens in the United States, but also the ways in which cultures of African American people and people of African descent are not recognized as such. We have a question from Antoinette. With such a painful history, is it even possible to share a living experience without leaning into the wrongs made against a group of people, both historically and in everyday life, by default, pulling in tropes of activism? So a really good question. And, I think some of us even think of, our work as educators as activism as well. So just talking about something painful, celebratory, joyous, something in between in terms of complexity, isn't that activism in itself? Great questions to start off with. If we could go to the next slide, Dimitri. So this question about to move from activism, and that doesn't mean to leave activism behind, but maybe to slide into this other key word for us this week is aesthetics. So as you can see from the slide here, this is a sort of boiled down definition of aesthetics and contextualization that I'm offering because it's definitely a term that hangs around art history and, of course, to a large extent, the study of philosophy in terms of assessing things, assessing them for their value and their worth in terms of the beautiful. And of course, in terms of artworks or anything that's made as a cultural production. In the present, though, we often wonder about aesthetics in terms of maybe a sort of hierarchy of things, that some things are seen as autonomously or inherently beautiful. And for that reason, we should think about what is happening when somebody talks about an aesthetic in a way that seems not only rarefied, but sometimes maybe has a bit around it, almost like a boundary. Just humorously, I've offered this quote from Barnett Newman, one of the New York School abstract expressionist artists, who said, "Aesthetics is for the artist what ornithology is to birds." I don't know if the sort of twisted Barney Newman humor is evident there, but if apparently what he's saying is artists do what they do. We don't have to study and read aesthetic tomes to access and to create. Sean has a really good point here in the chat about Vincent Price and the idea of new Blackness in the Americas. Yeah, so improvisation, as well as Sean's point about being able to perform. Fantastic. Remy talks about the practice of activating our past stories. Yeah, yeah. And that word improvisation often comes up, especially in terms of the different fields of African American studies. So exactly as Sean is saying, you're improvising on something that is already there, and yet you're changing it and maybe even moving it beyond. I think that a key point that I often use when talking about that is if you hear the Rodgers and Hammerstein tune, "My Favorite Things," and then listen to John Coltrane's instrumental version of it, it often helps us think about what does Coltrane take in terms of the core of that tune and the melody. Obviously, he strips it of the word. He doesn't sing along about my favorite things, but he takes something that is at the spine of the tune and then expands improvisationally as well as creatively. So next slide, please, Dimitri. So this figure, Flash of the Spirit, is the cover of a book published uh, and has been republished many, many, many times since its original publication in 1983. And you all can see my dog-eared book. I have a more up-to-date copy that the publisher sent me. I think it's still coming out by Vintage Press, $9.95 when it was first published. And I think you can still get it pretty much in every bookstore, if not a museum store. I think what's important too is to think about the way that Robert Farris Thompson, who I don't think has retired from Yale, where he studied as an undergraduate, went to school as a PhD student, and then became a professor there, is that the subtitle of the book is African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy. So right away, he's expanding the scope of his study. It's not just the visual object of art, but it's philosophy, the ways in which he thinks people of African descent are thinking. and are making their way through the world, because that's of course what philosophy is. So looking at the book, if you were able to see in Google Books the way it's described as how the book shows 5 African civilizations, the Yoruba, the Congo, Ejagam, Mande, and Cross River, and how these civilizations have informed and reflected the aesthetic, the social, and the metaphysical traditions in music, sculpture, textiles, architecture, religion, and ideogrammatic writing of Black people in the United States, in Cuba, in Haiti, in Trinidad, in Mexico, in Brazil, and other places in the New World. And I hope maybe if you, how close you are to your screen tonight, you can see that the blurb at the top of the book above Flash says, and this is from the New York Times Book Review, it says, convinces the reader there is a real and important significance in the term Afro-American. So this is quite astonishing, right? That here is what Thompson is doing in 1984, is convincing someone who's presumably a skeptic that there is something called Afro-American, something that is tied to the African continent. And contrary to what some early scholars had said, such as Melville Herskovitz, who was Zora Neale Hurston's student, he wasn't so sure that there were so many things that could be read as African, that a lot of things had been lost. Now, there are 2 hot links here that Dimitri can put into the chat either now or later, but I thought we might look at a little bit of the first hot link, which is a keynote speech, just a little bit of the keynote speech that Thompson gives at a conference at Harvard in 2016, not to take any light from Dimitri's interview with Thompson in 2010. So let's click on that first hot link. We're just going to listen to a little bit of it to see Thompson in his prime.
Journey into the second session. So I invite you all to
and to hear the introduction of him.
Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, elders and juniors. I have the honor of introducing Professor Robert Ferris Thompson this afternoon, the Colonel John Trumbull Professor of the History of Art at Yale University, one of his many sites of orientation for the past 50+ years. Professor Thompson has devoted his life to studying Africana philosophies and engaging sacred arts of the African and African Atlantic world. And according to anthropologist J. Lauren Vittori, quote, while it has grown roots in a range of disciplines beyond his own, Thompson is the author of the felicitous coinage for Black Atlantic. Dr. Thompson's writings reverberate with a pulse and a vibrating spirit, and his lectures are permeated with a certain joie de vivre. As Dr. Thompson has thoughtfully mused, quote, if ecstasy is a formal goal of those religions of Africa and the diasporas, when all enthusiasms seemingly convert and cassé, you are broken by pleasure and pushed to the level of the Loa or Orisha or Mikisi. If that's the goal, then how dare one even consider studying these cultures without a modicum of enthusiasm? In conversation with Donald Constantino, another specialist in African diasporic sacred arts who is here with us today, Thompson identified at least 3 key influences in the origin and trajectory of his research. The first being a realization of Black music as communalizing, as he played boogie woogie and listened to whistle blues in West Texas, born in El Paso in 1932, and the percussive emphasis in mambo as a bridge between jazz and rock and roll, which you can see in his work Aesthetic of Kikuyu. In the second instance, after hearing a Black classmate speak of a hanging crystal in a doorway as heaven-like, he would come to recognize the Black Atlantic's spiritual attention to quartz and light, glass, glitter, and mirrors. And this we can see in the title of Flash of the Spirit, which has remained in continuous publication since its release in 1983. Yet another encounter included his witnessing a pattern among Cubans in Havana, Puerto Ricans in New York, and Nigerians in Yoruba land, whereby they would move their dress in time to the downbeat of the music playing in ceremony. And we can see this echoed in his work African Art in Motion from 1974. In forthcoming works, Thompson would reflect on these transformative experiences as almost cosmic callings to engage the sacred arts of the Black Atlantic. In 1955, Dr. Thompson would receive his BA from Yale University and completed his PhD at Yale in 1965 in the history of art, committing himself to studying both Yoruba and Kikongo, which are two different African language families. Let us just simply acknowledge what that meant in the 1950s and 60s. I should note that there have been speculations that he is one of the first, if not the first, art history PhD awarded whose dissertation research centered on African art in the United States. In Yoruba land of southwestern Nigeria and based at the University of Ibadan, Dr. Thompson would conduct art historical research, the proceeds of which would develop into his first book, Black Gods and Kings. He also presided over African and African Diaspora art exhibitions at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., resulting in the publication of the catalog The Four Moments of the Sun, Congo Art in Two Worlds, highlighting Congo as one of many constellation points of African diaspora origins in a world where Yoruba at sometimes seems prominent. His work, Face of the Gods, served as the first international study of altars of the Black Atlantic world, and Tango, the art history of love, was a book on the Central African foundations of Argentine cultures. His works have been translated into German, Portuguese, French, and Flemish. An allegory that resonates in particular is one offered by Donald Constantino, who observed that in many LA botanicas, as well as all over, I'm sure you all know, two texts often rest on the shelves in the back rooms for divinations: William Bascom's E5 Divination and Robert Ferris Thompson's Black Gods and Kings. And many have noted that Flash of the Spirit seems to disappear from many of these botanicas, all of these works having become sacred texts in and of themselves. On a personal note, I had the privilege of working with several of Dr. Thompson's students, including art historian Pablo Martinez Ruiz and anthropologist Greg Vantaker. In this academic generation, I can truly consider myself to be a junior, but somebody who has benefited from this establishing of Black Atlantic sacred art. So I am now able to base myself in religion with scholars such as Jacob Orupana, as well as art historians such as Suzanne Billier. And like so many of us, I consider your work and consider you to be so much of an academic grandfather. Lastly, I want to say that one of his quotes really moves me and I think reveals how much he is dedicated to emic scholarship. He says, "A guerrilla scholar must move in many worlds and must honor the speakers of that world in their own speech," end quote. His work has revealed the ways in which religious technologies may be interpreted in numerous ways, incorporating everything from healing knowledge and divination rites to sacred arts, digital technology, and divine dance. Considering his contributions to Africana religions and ritual arts, we were certain that his remarks would greatly contribute to our rich discussions regarding the divine and digital. Robert Ferris Thompson serves as a scholar who has positioned Black sacred arts and Blackness, broadly speaking, as cultural authors rather than social others. And I will end with a quote. When I mentioned to a reverend who has done work here on campus at Harvard University for many years, his name is Reverend Eugene Rivers, when I mentioned to him that I considered myself following the course of a path charted in part by Robert Ferris Thompson doing Black Atlantic Sacred Arts, he said, "Oh, that is fantastic. Robert Ferris Thompson is like the Sun Ra of Black studies, just cosmic blackness." That is Dr. Ferris Thompson.
All right, first of all, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for coming because you saved me from what the late great Dizzy Gillespie once had to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank both of you. How many of you have heard the story of when the late Senator Kennedy asked what black art was about? Good, my kind of audience. Then Kennedy went up to the Odiabite, the spiritual overlord of all the Yoruba, and said, "Your Highness, I'm having trouble with African art. I can't tell one image apart from the other. What is African art?" And the chief looked at him and said, "Senator mi dada, Yoruba mo como niti alei. Oda raju we play, mo pada si America, kya kya, shut the hill." I thought that was one of the hippest responses I ever heard. Translated to African American, Teddy baby, if you don't know what black art is by now, don't mess with it. We're going to let black art mess with us in all its sainted glory. First of all, I want you to imagine that you are working for the Emperor of the 8th Galaxy, and he has assigned you to probe this planet and see if there's light. So you cruise over, next slide please. Next slide please. You cruise over. Yeah. Okay. Cruise over.
So he's going to have a bunch of technical difficulties. We can cut it here.
Yeah, you stay here so.
So he's going to have a bunch of technical difficulties, but you can see that the audience is with him, and other things that you've noticed by just not only the introduction and to the answer to the question. No, I didn't even hear the name of the person introducing him. But what are some of the other impressions that you have of Thompson from the way the person introducing him said and the way that he introduced him to the audience, and to say nothing of the way the audience was responding to him? Yeah, Rula, devoted fans. You can see the reason why, it's such a bad video too, is people are coming in, walking in front of the camera. The room is filling up. He's totally like a rock star. You heard the introducer say, oh yeah, he's the Sun Ra of scholars studying of Black studies. Respect for the elders, ancestors in life. Yes, he's talking about speaking of an elder in Africa who is responding to a question from JFK. Yeah, cosmic blackness, a scholar that touches people like an ancestor. Sounded a little bit like church. Yeah, definitely. He's definitely trying to give you that almost that clergyman, that preacher resonance in terms of how he's engaging with you. And he starts off with the joke, right? It's like, thank you, in case there was nobody here, thank you both of you. Humor, absolutely. And somebody right from the beginning said, did you see how it is about music? Aswan, he entered the window through music. Great. If we could just go to the next slide too. This is the thing with Thompson, is that this book is, its title in terms of what's always put at the top of the area in terms of subject is art history. And again, he's talking about objects, he's talking about performances, he's talking about cultural practices in this book, as we said, of 5 African civilizations. And but he is insisting on using a very recognizable language of art history, and people recognize it as such. The Philadelphia Inquirer calls it in the back blurb, "This is art history to dance by." The thing that I wanted you to look at, if you don't have a copy of this book at hand, and you promise not to misuse the bootleg copy of it online, there's a PDF that I just sent the link to, is how he starts off this book. In the acknowledgements, he drops names, some of them that we've heard before in this class, like he mentions Zora Neale Hurston, and he mentions Sidney Mintz, and he mentions them as people whose work has influenced him, even after the time of their deaths posthumously. Zora Neale Hurston is long dead by the time that this book is published. But if you would permit me, those of you who have a copy of this book or have been able to do a download of it can follow along. The first paragraph of it is so elegant. This is the introduction. Introduction, the rise of the Black Atlantic visual tradition. Listening to rock, jazz, blues, reggae, salsa, samba, bossa nova, juju, high life, and mambo, one might conclude that much of the popular music of the world is informed by the flash of the spirit of a certain people, specially armed with improvisatory drive and brilliance. I'm going to jump down a couple of paragraphs. Flash of the Spirit is about visual and philosophical streams of creativity and imagination, running parallel to the massive musical and choreographic modalities that connect Black persons of the Western Hemisphere, as well as the millions of European and Asian people attracted to and performing their styles to Mother Africa. Aspects of the art and philosophy of the Yoruba of Nigeria, the end of the Republic of Benin, the Bakongo of the Bazaire and neighboring Cabinda, Congo Brazzaville and Angola, the Fan and the Ewe of the Republic of Benin and Togo, the Mande of Mali and neighboring territory, the Ajacam of the Cross River region in southeastern Nigeria and southwest Cameroon have come from sub-Saharan Africa to the Western Hemisphere. So one more excerpt. All of these traditions are ancient and charged with the nobility of blood and purpose, and all of them, with the exception of the villager Ejigam, are urban. Since the Middle Ages or earlier, the ancestors of the Yoruba, the Bakongo, the Fan, and the Mande peoples have lived in commanding towns, centers of visual richness and creativity. These civilizations not only were impressive for their urban density, refinement, and complexity, but were empowered with an inner momentum of conviction and poise that sent them spiraling out into the world, overcoming accidents of class, status, and political oppression. So I hope you can hear in the way that Thompson is literally copying the language that had been applied to arts of Europe, mostly by the founders of art history in the 19th century in terms of civilization, in terms of studying about beauty, in terms of studying about urban developments, in terms of studying about refinement and complexity. And he's definitely wanting art historians to hear that he's copying their lexicon and using it persuasively to speak of the language, the cultures, and the art forms of people of African descent. So he's saying, and I'm going to show you what I mean in this book. Somebody just mentioned in the chat a while ago, interesting that no one mentions that he is white. Yeah, maybe everyone knew that but I didn't. Yeah, and he's there, trying to use what we would recognize as a certain kind of cadence of a certain part of Black America. He's there in terms of dropping knowledge, in terms of, I know who Dizzy Gillespie is because I'm a hipster who came of age in the 1950s. And he's also using the idea of I can speak African languages. So not only is he multilingual in terms of languages of art history, such as French and German, but he also is multilingual in African languages. And remember, the person introducing him said that he knows Congo languages as well as languages coming from the Bantu family of languages and cultures. So Veronica has this question about the word flash. So remember in the introduction how the person at this conference was saying that Thompson notices the idea of the import of use of glass, of quartz, of shiny things that reflect, and obviously maybe I think things that refract and that light goes into. And that's what he's thinking about in terms of this word of the flash of the spirit, that is something that he's going to say, I see it across all sub-Saharan African cultures and cultural and visual production. And this is what distinguishes him from the people who are saying, well, maybe they're not all the same culture, like Mintz and Price. Mintz and Price are saying, Africans came from many different cultures from the continent, were brought together as communities of enslaved people, even starting from the moment of being on slavers crossing the Atlantic, and then forged something new based on their different systems. Thompson is saying, no, Black is this here, and I see it here in the same way. Mintz and Price would say to him, you're identifying a set of limited formal qualities, and you're not thinking about the complexity of their meanings, not only to the artists who make them, but also to the people who are part of the audience. There are distinctions. I hope that helps a little bit, Veronica, and we can come back to it. Yes, Thompson is also an initiate of Ifa, who talks about Ifa divination practices in Flash of the Spirit as well. Becca reminds me of the Krista Thompson book, Shine. Yeah, absolutely. Good to hear from you, Becca. Great. So, key figures. And they're doing this work not only thinking about their work as scholarly interventions, but the insistence that Africans and people of African descent have culture, which in the period of even going into the late 20th century, people are still thinking that Africa is a void. People of African descent don't produce anything that is unique, and people of African descent do not register when you think of visual art forms. People think of music, maybe people think of dance, but they don't think of the object making practices. And I like what somebody said earlier, again, to go back to the point about Thompson coming through through music. It comes across in the first paragraph of the text. And it's what he talks about most now. He's lecturing on mambo across the world. And the really poignant thing is that he's actually losing his hearing. So he is wearing hearing aids. And that's something that I just think is, for somebody who music has meant so much to him from his whole life. It's a sort of cruel turn of fate. Yeah, I would say that Thompson is an essentialist, and this is the difference between maybe his student, David Brown, who was my teacher, and is thinking as a constructionist, and me. But much respect. It's almost like my intellectual grandfather in a way, so much respect to my elder. We go to the next slide, Dimitri, and we'll take a break probably at the top of the hour, just for people watching the clock. So I'm showing you an image of an artist who was a groundbreaking artist in terms of having his work shown in a major museum, William Edmondson. You can see that he's born in the period after enslavement in the US. And he lives until mid 20th century. And he is a self-taught sculptor. And in a way, what Thompson talks about in Flash of the Spirit is not just obviously the Congo and the Yoruba and the Ejigam traditions, but he's also early in his career, as early as the 1960s, thinking about what he sees as African in the United States. So he even has an essay decades before this book is published in the 1960s about African influences in African American, or using the parlance, I think, of that time, Afro-American art. And one of the ways in which he saw African retentions and African survivals were through headstones and gravestones. In the 1930s, in the US and elsewhere in the world, a lot of sculptors were thinking about direct carving as a method. So rather than working in marble, sending things out to people who would make a larger scale version of a sculpture that would then become something that would be monumental or decorative for museums as well as for domestic interiors, people thinking about direct carving were saying this is not only the ways in which we can see the hand of the artist, but it is seen as a more honest way of dealing with the material and dealing with yourself as an artist. So, this is an idea that certainly goes back to not only people making ritual sculpture that might be tied to religious practices across the world, but certainly if you think of Leonardo and the ways in which we could see his chisel mark in sculpture projects such as the Slaves project that he did during the Renaissance, and Michelangelo and others. The idea that this kind of direct engagement with the medium is the most honest and authentic way to produce sculptural work in three-dimensionality. Now, Edmondson is, quote, discovered by people who are in the art world, traveling around the South in the early 1920s. The photograph that you see here is done by Louise Dahl Wolfe, a New York-based white American photographer who does this portrait of him at work. And then her contemporary, Edward Weston, also a white American, does a photograph of his storefront, if you will, his outdoor yard. Often people talk about Edmondson as a folk artist. Other words that are used are seeing him as an outsider artist because he's seen as outside of the art industry, self-taught artist. And even in the time of the 1930s, you will see the word primitive being used to talk about his way of working and his way of speaking and being. And these people who are talking about it, it's a sort of double-edged sword when they're talking about him as self-taught as well as primitive. A lot of artists who are coming from European traditions and even the European American traditions in North America are saying that they're trying to access the primitive within them. That is to say, they're trying to forget things that they may have learned in art schools or in ateliers or from the traditional academies of Europe and to some extent in North America. They're trying to get closer to the things that seem to come out of their very souls. So if you look at some of the press coverage of Edmondson's exhibitions in the 1930s, and he was the first Black American artist to be exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s. This rhetoric of primitivism is just on view in total, as is this idea of him as a folk artist, which is seen as different from a gallery artist. The one reason I'm also showing you the Edward Weston photo of William Edmondson's yard from the 1940s is you see a lot of his work that is essentially being shown for display to his community. And there's a scholar in the 1980s wrote an essay. His name is Eugene Metcalf, Eugene, E-U-G-E-N-E, and his last name is Metcalf, M-E-T-C-A-L-F. And what Metcalf is saying is that there's a lot of different ways that this term folk artist is being used. And, you know, there are folk artists who, quote, are people who have not been trained, obviously, in terms of going to art schools or working with a so-called master. There are also people who are generally recluses, hermits who work in isolation, never sharing any of their work with any of their family or friends. Thompson writes about one of these artists named James Hampton, who was a DC-based artist, had a day job working for the General Services Administration in the early 20th century, and then passed away, I think, in the 1960s, and was working on a huge project with found objects in a garage that he rented. And the project was only discovered after he had passed away. So here's an artist that isn't even thinking about an audience, but is just motivated to do something and go big. If he's renting a garage, you get a sense of scale. Yes, The Throne of the Third Heaven, which is now in the collection of the Smithsonian of the American Art Museum in Washington. It is an astonishing piece of work. I mean, just the focus. And talk about flash of the spirit, Veronica. That is exactly why someone like Thompson would bring it as an example, because what James Hampton did was he gathered things that were thrown away, found objects, furniture, bits of bric-a-brac, you know, things that would be decorative sculpture, and he covered them with foil. So imagine the bling of these things and the idea that when someone opened the garage door and finally discovered it and turned the light on, it was probably like, you know, kapow, like wow. And this is how it's displayed at SAM in DC now. But just to finish up with what I'm saying about Metcalf and this photo from Edward Weston of the 1940s, Metcalf says that the true folk artist must have an audience or a consumer base. And this is why we can see William Edmondson as a folk artist, because People bought gravestones from him. He was known in his community. He was known as someone who was obviously not only making this work that was both decorative, but also utilitarian, that was artistic. And what we can see from the sculpture in the image of Dal Wolf and what Edmondson is doing with his chisel is that a lot of the work was figurative. He is definitely using simplified forms of angels. Oftentimes these forms are very pared down. And also they are things that still have a bit of volumetric presence, as well as personality and in terms of stolid form. Even as they're very simplified, some of them are geometric, some of them are very blocky. I wanted us to look at another artist, if we can go to the next slide, a little bit different from the roughness that we see in the Edmondson sculpture, which is a very desired attribute of modernist sculpture. So some of you might know this artist, Wilfredo Lam, born in Cuba. And what Lam brings to us is this idea of modernism, and this is a big tent of modernism that is both something that is going to be very much pared down and simplified when we think about certain ways of making two-dimensional work, whether it's painting or drawing. But I wanted you to again see how Lam starts out. Yeah, Lam is fantastic. The self-portrait here of 1926. So Lam is working in a very naturalistic way in this portrait of himself, pencil on paper. I don't know where this work is held. I saw it online, so I don't know the dimensions. It is a self-portrait, Iswan. And he is giving us a sense of his own physical form, right? The proportions are what we would expect. You know, every feature of a face is there that we would expect: 2 eyes, a nose, you know, even in sort of 3/4 portrait view, we don't see him fully frontal, lips, hair, etc. So this looks like a kind of human being that we would see on the street. This is somebody that we would pass and recognize, right? If we go to the next slide. Great. So now 2 self-portraits by Lam. Again, the one of 1926, the pencil on paper, and another one where don't know where this work is held, but saw it online, dates to 1938. What's the difference here? Holler at me in the chat. One is more representational. Yeah. First one more realistic. Yeah. Influence of Cubism. Yeah. Yeah. Matisse-like background. Absolutely. Yep. Second one, more reductive. Yeah. Flat two-dimensionality. So we can see Lam moving in the 1920s from an artist who's clearly studied the sort of naturalistic strategies of representing the body in terms of giving you the illusion that this drawing of 1926 is of a three-dimensional body, right? That's the thing about working on the two-dimensional surface, right? It's supposed to giving us an illusion of something that is three-dimensional when we know it's flat. We can't touch his air. We would only be touching the piece of paper that he's drawing on. He is then, though, a modern subject. There's something about the way that Lam looks here that looks obviously different from the way Phyllis Wheatley looked in the frontispiece we saw to her collected poems, right? There's something that seems to be of the 20th century in terms of not only the ways in which the artist Lam himself is working, and it's very persuasive, naturalistic, realistic portrait, but also seemingly the power of this subject in both cases, the 1926 self-portrait as well as the 1930s self-portrait. So Lam has traveled to Europe in the 1920s. He is clearly looking at what is emerging as the school of Paris modernism, where painters and sculptors and photographers and other artists are saying, we are done with trying to give you the illusion of three-dimensionality when we work in these two-dimensional formats. That is to say, painting is about flatness. It is about the flatness of the canvas surface. It is about the flatness of the board that we paint on. It is about, drawing is about the flatness of the paper. So we can stop pretending that we're doing something three-dimensional. So people have talked about Cubism as an influence. He is a friend of Picasso's. He's hanging out with artists who clearly know and have developed Cubism. He knows about Matisse right on from Marla and others, looking at the backdrop in the 1938 self-portrait. And he's even thinking about this idea that the body can be presented in a way that is very forthcoming. And his nakedness there, right, becomes a sort of pronouncement of authenticity, forthrightness, naturalness, as well as honesty. So looking at some of the comments here, tons of good observations here. Definitely using more color in terms of the oil on canvas work of the 1930s. And think about the difference in color, not only because the 1920s work is pencil and the 1930s work is oil paint, but one of the sort of hallmarks of modernism is that artists move away from color that looks like color in the world, whether they're working in oil paint or acrylic paint or even in pencil and crayon. They bring in colors that are more vibrant and not so much looking like the color of one's hair or the color of a tree, right? They're bringing in color to speak to their emotion of working, their ways of presenting their personality in the work. Yes, full circle in that Picasso and Matisse drew from African art. And yes, Lam is both of Chinese and African descent. Let's go to the next image. So now I want to show you Lam back in Cuba from the time of the 1940s. Like everybody in Europe, he knows that war is coming as of the 1930s, and he gets on up out of there and says, let me get back to the other side of the Atlantic where there's not a massive conflict happening across the European continent. Here's a photograph by Mark Shaw of him working in his studio in 1950. And he's seeing Lam. The reason why you see the title of the Shaw photograph in italics is, even at this point of the mid-20th century, Lam is being recognized as an artist. So you see this kind of celebrity photography in terms of what Shaw does in terms of titling it. I'm capturing an important artist at work in his studio of 1950. So that 1950 that's italicized is also part of the title of the work to show you the stature of Lam at this stage of his career. So someone has been writing about his work in terms of religious production or inspired by religious production. And this is, again, to think about the ways in which diaspora is being defined, not only by people like Thompson and Minson Price, my academic PhD advisor, David Brown, Holloway, and others, is if we look at this work, The Jungle of 1943 in the next slide. And this is where you really feel like looking at a slide doesn't do the work justice. So if you ever go to New York, you will see this work in the Museum of Modern Art. It's huge, 94 inches by 90 inches, so almost 8 feet tall. And what we're seeing here is Lam working in the 1940s on a canvas, gouache and paper mounted on canvas that is almost like abstract expressionist scale. So think about this idea of the jungle. We should think about the jungle as a space as well as a sense of place and a sense of mind. He is making the landscape of the jungle large and monumental, not unlike what landscape painters have been doing for many centuries in both North America, South America, and Europe, to say nothing of Asia and landscape traditions in Japanese and Chinese art. But the difference here is the modernism in the ways that Lam is presenting the jungle. This painting is a really shallow representation of the jungle, right? Even though there's a suggestion that, you know, there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, everything seems to be flattened and comes to the front of the picture plane, both the flora and the fauna, the animals and the leaves. And what we see here is this sense of the tropical environment, you know, sugarcane, tobacco leaves, you know, and these are things that are absolutely relevant to the Cuban plantation economy and its agricultural production. Look at the ways in which the figures, these strange creatures, have these raised palms and their feet are turned around and in a sort of funny position in relation to where we think we're looking at them. There's also in this painting, I'm just going to open up my slides so I can see it a little better and guide you. If we look at the top right of the work, right, there's this three fingers that seem to be holding up a scissors, right? Well, scissors, clippers, right, of course, are tools for gathering herbs and gathering plants for rituals. And people looking at this work, thinking about Santeria and other African diasporic religions, think about the scissors being made oftentimes and cutters and clippers being made with metal. So what we've thought about in terms of this painting is that there's a Santeria element to this subject of the jungle, as if this metal scissors might be a tool of a Santeria god, namely the god of metal, Oshun. Some of the comments here. Would this be considered Orphism, Megan? Orphism may be in terms of color, but not the sort of planar presentations of color that you would see like in Robert Delaunay or Sonia Delaunay's Orphism as the kind of examples. Yeah, Sean reminds me of Mata, the Chilean surrealist. Yes, Lam is definitely thinking about surrealism, was part of that circle in Paris, which again is another European artistic circle that is definitely influenced by non-Western cultures, including African cultures, especially those of the sub-Saharan. So, you know, we have here this landscape of the magic terrain of Santeria, the El Monte, where the Orishas, the god of Santeria religions, live. As we can think about where enslaved people often fled to get away from plantation and other spaces of oppression, right? We can think about the Maroons and others who fled plantation life in Jamaica and elsewhere. Yeah, Joan, great point about how the forms fit together almost as a quilt. Incredible ability Lam has to give us a sense of this densely packed area. Let's look at the next slide. So, thinking about European modernist, what's the relationship to Picasso and to Lam? What do people think? Yeah, lots of movement suggested in the Lam, Darlene, absolutely, in terms of angles, right? That creates movements. Yeah, everything in the front of the picture plane, similar size, yes, and verticality, absolutely, similar flatness, right? So I think, you know, there's a way in which with the Picasso that, you know, Lam and Picasso are in a conversation, and Lam is like saying, anything you can do, I can do better. The non-local color of the Picasso, right? These are presumably white bodies. The story of Demoiselle d'Avignon is that these ladies of Avignon were Picasso's representations of sex workers in a brothel in Spain. And we see them presented in ways that are both like not naturalistic in terms of some of the angles. Look at that figure on the bottom right, whose back is toward us, but has a mask-like face that's looking back toward us. The incredible angles of the forum. Yes, exactly. The figures look like they're wearing masks, even the ones that look more realistic, like the figure at the center, right? There's something that is very sculptural about this work. And this is because Picasso is looking at non-Western work and even work made by indigenous artists of the Americas. And it is informing the way he is transforming his two-dimensional painterly strategies of making work by incorporating what he's learning from these three-dimensional art forms, whether it's in terms of ritual sculpture, totem poles, etc. Yeah, Lam's treatment of limbs and joints suggests four-legged animals at the same time as bipeds. Yeah, so there's a sense of the surrealist and the fantastic that Lam is drawing up here. Great. They suggest different music. Yeah, for sure. Before we have our break, which we should right now, just for like 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. Think about the subject matter of the Picasso in terms of the nude. These nude women as a motif that has been seen in Western art, from the post-Enlightenment Italian Renaissance period and forward. And think about the way that the figures in the Lam painting are differently presented as nudes and as naked people. All right, so it's 12 minutes after the hour here in San Francisco. Can we come back at like 15 minutes after the hour? Have a quick break? I'll see you in a minute. So we're coming back, I hope. So again, thinking about, the movement from the modern subject as Lam positions himself in that first self-portrait, very naturalistic, very forthright, his gaze meeting the audiences. Then this move toward a subject that's not only modern, but not modernistic. And I really actually mean this in terms of capital M, modernism, as a sort of school, even though there are many kinds of modernisms in terms of artistic strategies. Um, and then, looking at the jungle as a sort of modernistic representation of a natural space, but not with the sort of ideas that the picture is a three-dimensional, a window through which you can put your hand through and look toward and sort of and touch something that's beyond the interior room that you're in. Yeah, thanks, Merritt, for the comment about the idea of the art market. That's again something that I would really love to keep thinking about with you, especially as I'm again challenging you all to think about, how would you put together an exhibition in terms of some of the artists maybe that we've talked about in this course, as well as some of the artists we haven't talked about. Some of you who are artists who are on the call tonight, as well as artists that colleagues, contemporary artists, to say nothing of historical artists. So let's go to another artist doing the subject of the nude. Dimitri, next slide. So this key work here that is done by Renee Stout as part of a series of works that were called Fetish is sculptural work. So again, moving across medium. I wanted just to think about what Stout's approach to presenting the nude is here. And we're going to pull that thread of the nude as a keyword, keywords, two words that talks about a kind of motif that we see in Western art. We just saw it in Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, right? And now we saw it in Wilfredo Lam in terms of his semi-nude body in that work of the 1930s. And now we're seeing it with Renee Stout. And as you can expect, yeah, she made this to scale based on her own body. So thinking about this work by an artist who is, I'm giving you not only her birth year, but the fact that she was born here in the United States, born in Kansas, raised in Pittsburgh, someone who studied art at Carnegie Mellon University and got a BFA there. And if we could go to the next slide, Dimitri, thank you. You can see some of her early works. And I'm again showing you this just like I showed you the early work of Lam a few minutes ago. Remember that we talked about the work of Aaron Douglas last week, the work that he's better known for in terms of this sort of synthetic cubism, figural abstraction. But remember I said that he did a lot of his work, the work that he was commissioned to do were these realistic paintings, commissioned portraits. So we see here with Renee Stout at the top left, her painting Hanging Out of 1983, which is a kind of genre picture. That is to say, a picture of everyday life of these male figures standing outside of a building that seems to be very contemporary to the 1980s. And then I'm also showing you Maul It, a Pittsburgh still life, also by Stout, just so you can see the difference and distinction in the way this artist is working, not just the difference and distinction between painting and sculpture, but also the difference in how she's presenting a body that is, again, not entirely realistic in Hanging Out, because there's something that seems to be stretched out, elongated with these men that are sitting and standing. The they seem to be a little bit not fully three-dimensional. She is playing with color, not only in terms of their garments and the backdrop, in terms of the building, really heightening the intensity of color, and also the ways in which she presents their color doesn't seem entirely naturalistic, albeit realistic, because we recognize them as human beings. It's not that she's made them totally abstract, like the bodies in Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, or these kind of mixed species bodies in Wilfredo Lam's Jungle. So maybe that's the difference between realism and naturalism. Naturalism is when we imagine something that looks like something that we can see in life, the way people are acting and moving and appearing. Realism can be abstract. It can be sort of figuratively abstract, but there's something about it that just makes us go, that doesn't exactly look like the kind of person I would see, in terms of why are they looking so just maybe a little bit summarized, or maybe a little bit too um, amplified in terms of the way the body is presented. Yeah, that's a great point, Neva, in terms of the sign clothes has many different echoes. And great points, Rula, about the objectification of Black bodies. I also put in the still life here, mullet, so that you could just think about still life in terms of still lives maybe you've seen in other contexts, still lives of things of fruit, of books, of skulls, of flowers, in terms of many European traditions, amongst them the Netherlandish traditions of the 17th century, in which these objects, these usually inanimate objects, have symbolic meaning, allegorical meaning, in terms of things that we can eat and consume, as well as things that maybe feed us in different ways, like the way books do. So still lifes are usually inanimate objects, and look at what Renee Stout chooses as a still life here, in terms of these these bottles of sauce, very special to Pittsburgh, the mullet barbecue sauce. In comparison to another Pennsylvania product, that is to say Heinz tomato ketchup. And I'm thinking about these bottles of sauce, and maybe I'm getting too deep into it, as signs of economic modernity. That is to say, manufactured, mass-produced commodities that are being presented here like pop art objects by Renee Stout. So yes, Unjin Park has jumped ahead to think about yes in Kisi. So let's look at the next slide here, Dimitri, of there's a photo of the artist here, still from a video that she made in 2000 called I Can Heal, so you can see what her body looks like, albeit 12 years after Fetish number 2 was made in 1988. And obviously she's not standing up in this photograph, but I just wanted you to see her face, her skin color, and a sense of the scale of her body. Then we could go to this next slide, which is a long text, but just see what we can get out of it in terms of what she's telling us her goals are. So, she's saying that the work is both about her own point of view, her own positionality as a woman of African descent, but an African American woman. She's also speaking about storytelling, her story, as well as the stories of people whose stories are not well told. She's interested in bearing witness in terms of presenting narratives of people who are both historical as well as contemporary. And she's willing to also thinking about the ways in which that we're all functioning despite the challenges in what she calls the theater of the absurd, which goes back to theater traditions of the 20th century in terms of modernist literature as well. And she's speaking of this as a form of resistance and as an escape route. This idea of healing too, despite all the pressures of the world, I think is something that Dimitri and I were talking about earlier in terms of, all of our interests now about care and about healing and about self-care seem to be things that uh, Stout was almost presaging and predicting long before they became 21st century buzzwords. So next slide, please, Dimitri. Okay. So clearly what's inspired, as Unjung Park has noted, um, uh, uh, Renee Stout, are these ritual sculptural forms called Inkisi, singular Inkisi, plural Minkisi. And these are sculptures from the Congo in Central Africa that are ritual artworks. That is to say that they operate as not only works of art in terms of being things that are seen as pleasurable to look at and accomplishments of craft and form, but also they are utilitarian. So the ways in which the Inkisi sculpture is made, and you see two objects here that are from the Metropolitan, two views of an object that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Metropolitan Museum of Art. We don't know the name of the artist, but we know that they come from the tradition of artists working in this Central African form. Is that a person visits like a healer or a doctor and says, I want to change something. Something's going on that's important in my life, or I'm about to undertake an important act. I'm about to get married, or I'm about to buy property or something like that. And this Inkisi sculpture becomes both obviously something that's figurative, what we would expect when we see something in terms of ritual art, in terms of something that looks like portrait sculpture, but it's also a vessel. So it's a statue of a human, but you can also see with the front view there that it's a cavity that has been created in the ventral area, the front of the sculpture. And notice how smooth the back is in terms of this particular sculpture. There's nothing there that's a cavity. We do see the incisions that suggest, the difference between the arm and the elbow and the upper arm and the wrist. So a person visits a doctor, a healer, and says, I'm going to do something that's important. It could even be protection from someone, or trying to repair a relationship that's gone bad, or even in some terms for revenge against someone. The person who's the ritual healer or the doctor will go to an artist, having heard what the commissioning client wants, and says, okay, I need one of these Inkisi. I want something, you know how to make this kind of sculpture, but I'm going to work with you in terms of how we're going to make the sculpture specific to what my client needs in order to get the outcome that my client wants. So the carved figure comes from the artist who makes the Inkisi, and then the ritual healer, the ritual doctor says, okay, we're going to put this in the sculpture's cavity in order to create this powerful medicine. It can be herbs, it can be soil, it can be ashes, it can be seeds, it can be crushed bone. It can be all of these things from the natural world, and it's going to go into this cavity. The other thing that happens, as you can see with the Inkisi, is that there's also nails that can be attached to the exterior, the form. And the nail is almost like a pledge. Every bit of this kind of piercing act of putting in the nail into sculpture is like a pledge. It is like a commitment to bringing about the outcome that you want in terms of why you've commissioned this Nkisi. It can be sharp blades, it can be nails, it can be even sort of pieces of wood shards. And that's what's activating the figure. That's what's making the figure work. So if it was just the sculpture made by the artist, the Nkisi form, it wouldn't have the same meaning. It wouldn't work ritualistically. It would work formally, but not ritualistically. Julie, is that a question? Client, artist, healer, spirit. Client, artist, client goes to the ritual doctor, a ritual healer, who then goes to the artist and says, makes the Nkisi. Then the figure comes back to the ritual healer who says, this is what my client needs. We're gonna make this thing special with the herbs and the nails, etc. And then it's going to be delivered, and the client is going to know, okay, I have to do this in order to make this thing happen. Now, the difference, of course, between what's going on with these conventions of Nkisi, these conventions of ritual sculpture, is that Renee Stout is making her work, Fetish Number 2, obviously for a gallery and museum audience. It does not have the same utilitarian function, right? It is different. Just in the same way, to be honest, that Picasso's African-inspired, Asian-inspired, Indigenous American-inspired painting only functions as a painting. It doesn't function as a ritual object, even though I guess we could make a point about it being of commodity culture. She makes a cast of her body. What you can see here is that it's very much naturalistic, even to the point of, look at the ways that the knees are brought together, and the position of her feet, right? So she's a different kind of, not entirely formally presented and symmetrical sculptural form than the Nkisi, which is right next to her. She's showing the personality of her particular body in this work of self-portraiture, including its sort of imbalance. I mean, you probably watch me on these broadcasts shifting between my weight from foot to foot and bouncing around. It's as if Renee Stout wants to show you that bit of human gesture, even in this static form. A couple of questions here. Do we know that it doesn't have the same utilitarian function? Is it possible that Renee creates them ritualistically? Of course, which is one of the reasons I showed you the image of her in her studio. Yes, but what I'm saying is that this work works in an art market. It is not a private relationship between her, another person who's an artist, and a healer, if that makes sense. And yes, we see the box on the exterior of Fetish Number 2 that is planted externally, right? And what she's gotten there is a little bit of an antique photo there, as if it is to signify maybe a birth, right? A pregnancy, fecundity in some ways. And it seems to be lit up as if you're speaking of the life that's yet to be born. I want to show you a couple of examples of artists who've been inspired by Nkisi, but let's look at the front to back form of the Renee Stout sculpture in the next slide, please, Dimitri. Great. So you can see here the rear and front view, right? Which again, very different from the Nkisi that we just saw from the Met's collection, right? Again, the sort of asymmetry of the body, the sort of naturalness of the pose, the use of something that suggests, you know, the hair growing down the back, as well as the way that the Fetish Number 2 also has ornamentation that is not exactly like the nails that we just saw on the Nkisi typically. And the idea of those little pouches though, being like almost like the herbal containers, right, to embody and to empower the sculpture. Dana Elliott, I'm very curious about the title. Seems like a series, yes, and the word fetish is a no. Yes, it's part of a series that she does. Some of them figural that look like her body. Some of them just objects called fetishes. And she definitely wants us to think about these kind of both primitivizing in the sense of authenticity and originality and honesty, but also the ways in which fetish has often been used as a sort of um, a negative term in a lot of Western artistic criticism as well as historical documentation, right? Fetish seems to clump together with other words like hut, right? Or superstition, right? In terms of its subjectivity and its uh, its its it's judgment. Yes, Veronica Jackson, you are going to be paid off for this in a second in terms of your recognition of how the backside of Renee Stout makes us think about a Matisse sculpture in his back series. Yeah, the mudras of the hands. Yes. I don't know enough about the significance of the gesture. There seems to be something that is not, while it's not giving you entirely prayerful hands, but look at the difference between the right and the left. One seems open, the other seems a little bit pinched, as if this figure is doing something in terms of meditation. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to go a little long tonight, but I hope you'll stick with me. So in terms of another artist thinking about Nkisi sculpture, I wanted to bring in this work that's in the local collection by Betty Saar in the University of California at Berkeley's museum, not too far from where I'm speaking to you tonight, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. And Saar is an artist whose career has really had many ups and downs in terms of recognition. I think a lot of people are looking at her work now, and certainly a lot of people are looking at her early work. So Saar is here talking about her influences to make this piece, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima in the 1970s. She was somebody who also worked with found objects. That is to say that she went to flea markets and bought things, bric-a-brac, magazines, jewelry, etc., because she was interested in this kind of assemblage practice. And what we see here is in the middle is one of her influences that she talks about, Joseph Cornell, a white American artist, several decades older than her. He was born in 1903 and died in 1972, and seen as this important surrealist artist, influenced by what was going on in Europe, and certainly knowing some of the surrealists when they came to the United States to get away from World War II and the conflict in Europe. So Saar says that she saw a Joseph Cornell show in the 1960s in Southern California, where she was born and raised. And she decided, different from what Joseph Cornell is doing in terms of this use of stamps, a reproduction of what is supposed to be a Medici princess, is that she's going to use some of the junk things that she's picked up at flea markets. So one of these things that we're seeing is that she is using things from commodity culture. And I chose this particular representation of The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, so you get a sense of its three-dimensionality. So this is a box in the Cornell fashion. It has mirrors lining the sides of it. And in the back, she's created a grid of Aunt Jemima images taken right from what would be seen as on the pancake box. So she is multiplying this notion of Aunt Jemima-ness in this pop art like grid fashion. You can think about Andy Warhol's grid works of Marilyn Monroe, and think about this work is made in the 1970s in the era of pop art. I'm always amazed that people don't talk about this as pop art, and I think that's because they see pop art as a white artist movement or white American artist movement. There's something about this work that absolutely insists on a sort of pop art humor, a pop art sensibility, a pop art form, and certainly a pop art critique of commodity culture, to say nothing of history. So, what SAR is doing here is, of course, critiquing, racist imagery, not only in terms of things that are part of the visual culture of the United States, history, illustrations, bric-a-brac, as we're going to see, and certainly utilitarian objects. If we can go to the next slide, Dimitri. The other thing that she's doing is that she's also studying African art. Sar's born in the 1920s, 1926 in LA. She studies art. She gets a BA in design in 1947 from Otis College of Art, if I'm not mistaken. And she also does graduate study in art history at Cal State Long Beach, at USC, at Cal State Northridge. And she also studies film at the American Film Institute. And what I'm showing you here is an article from 1975. So it's after the liberation of Aunt Jemima was made in 1972. But I know for sure, I remember reading this when I was in graduate school, that Sar heard Rubin talk about this idea of power and display in African culture. And he talks about Nkisi in this essay of 1975. And I think because Rubin was teaching at UCLA from 1967 onward, that Sar was influenced by his argument, that is that with this kind of accumulation in terms of African sculpture, not just the physical forms of wood that were carved and that were made, sometimes figuratively, sometimes abstractly, but then the accumulation of materials on top of them, beads, glass, nails, feathers, hair, things from nature, seeds, etc. And again, think back to the ways in which these things create power, not only in terms of the three-dimensionality of the form, but just the sort of the insistence of the form. So I think that Sar is clearly thinking about this kind of ritual sculpture because of her research in the 1960s and afterward. If we go to the next slide. Lost the view. Did I lose you guys? Oh, here we go. So if we hit advance. So just drawing your attention to what Sar is doing here, right? So she's looking at, she's gotten one of these figurines that, continues to be made of Aunt Jemima mammy figures, these sort of derogatorily realistic figures in terms of that they look like human beings, but they're so exaggerated to the sense of absurdity, in the sense of the eyes and the lips and the color and the bulk of the human being. And she's taken one of these sculptures and she's put it in this box, like I said, with the mirrors, as if to multiply Aunt Jemima-ness, right? And the absurdity of it, and the absurdity of racist stereotype that just seems to proliferate and just surround us. And what her source is she's taken out, if we can get the next slide, just hit advance, Dimitri. She's taken what you can still find now, not only online, but in some stores, a notepad holder. So these figurines are seen as domestic utilitarian objects in which there's a cavity in the lower part of the body that holds paper. And then where the broom is on the left-hand side would be the pencil holder. So sometimes it could have two sites for some object. Look at what the liberation of Aunt Jemima presents you. It gives you the broom, the mop of Aunt Jemima, but it also gives you a rifle, right? So this is the ways in which she's going to show you the power of the Aunt Jemima figure, a power of sort of Black womanhood and Black, even in terms of, I'm laughing because Catherine says, oh my, what is she going to do with that white baby? This is a sort of cheap lithograph of that SAR has found somewhere, in which that baby looks like it's in an awful state. And yeah, the way she's holding the baby in this representation also looks quite absurd as well, as if she's taking the baby for a bath or something. What else do we notice about the liberation of Aunt Jemima? She's taken a cutout that we can at first think about it as the skirt waist of the Aunt Jemima image in that central area. But looking at it closely, what do we see? A fist, a clenched fist, a Black power fist, right? A fist of not only a racial organization and racial and cultural organization, but of power and of labor. Think of the clenched fist in terms of the labor movements in this country and elsewhere. Okay, so just because we're getting close, let's move on. We can always talk more about these later. I want you to think about the ways in which we're going to see the nude in history. So just rolling through, just let's take 10 seconds on each of these images as we look at the way that Renee Stout is presenting her nude body. The next one, please, Dimitri. The next one, please, Dimitri. And the next one, please. And the next one, please. And one last one. Okay. So, I wanted you to think about the ways that some of you have already picked up on in terms of the Stout maybe focusing inward. Because notice another thing that she does in terms of borrowing from certain tropes of African sculpture, the eyes become these whitened areas, as if seeing outward isn't the most important thing, seeing what's in front of this sculpture, if we could stand in her form, but instead looking inward, which is why the comment about the sort of meditative pose of the hands, maybe the sort of mudra-like positioning of the four fingers, or even the sort of savasana of maybe imagining that hand as being right side of you as you take the resting position might be applicable here. The idea of a gaze too, in terms of these nudes as presented and showed you one as early as the Titian of the Italian Renaissance, as well as those of what would be seen as the modernist period of the Manet, in terms of the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, to say nothing of the modernism, as Veronica anticipated it, of Matisse's back bronze relief sculptures that he started designing in the second decade of the 1909 into the second decade of the 20th century. And this idea too of the nude in terms of what we expect in terms of female bodies being the nudes that Kehinde Wiley, if we can look at the slide right before this one, Dimitri, takes up. Certainly there's a tradition of male nudes. Wiley is of course well known for his portrait of former President Obama, but his fame was made of course in the ways that he was borrowing from the compositions of certain canonical European painting, and instead of white subjects being at the center of these works of art, he would install Black subjects. And his method was, of course, to study the composition of works by artists like Giraudet, among them, and say to some of his subjects who were everyday people that he would meet on the streets. He was New York based for a while and splits his time, I think, now between New York and Ghana, is that let's look at this book of classical European painting and sculpture together and tell me which ones do you appreciate. There's a question about the Wiley figure here, sleep, looking like a figure of Christ, as if it's a crucified figure of a Pietà. Someone, I may said it looks like the ecstasy of Saint Therese. Of course, we can think of the Bernini sculpture. I'm not sure which one this directly connects to, but I do think it might be one of Giraudet's sleep paintings, in which these figures are either in a state of actual slumber, almost a death-like slumber, or they're being visited by angelic figures who are giving them, again, reinforcing their piety. Catherine says, yes, the Christ in the lap of Mary looks like a Pietà. And the ways in which, right, these sort of sensual aspects of Wiley's work were there even in the examples, these paradigms for him in terms of Giraudet, an artist of the Romantic movement whose work is seen as very erotic and even homoerotic. If we go to the slide just before this one, Dimitri, I wanted you to see another Black artist's work, the Faith Ringgold project, in terms of her series of work called the French Collection. So here is the one called Matisse's Model. And what Ringgold has done with this work is presented us with a sort of pastiche of Matisse-like motifs, Matisse-like compositions. So his work, the dance, the blue background, the figures dancing at the top, his own image at the bottom right in terms of his own self-portraiture, as well as the ways in which he would present himself as he's painting nudes in these odalisque, exoticized formats and settings. You see a little bit of, on the top right there, or middle right, something that looks like it's from Matisse's Red Studio there as well. So, you know, what Faith Ringgold is doing in this series is she's giving us a fictional narrative, imagining that there was a woman, a Black woman, who had traveled from the United States to Paris in the 1920s, who was an aspiring painter and starts socializing with these canonical figures, these giants of the School of Paris, Matisse and Picasso, with literary figures such as Gertrude Stein, and that she is challenging herself to meet their model and to engage with them and to make her own mark, her own intervention as a modernist painter in the early decades of the 20th century. And it's important that, what Ringgold does here is that she is saying that she can own the new body, not unlike what we see with Renee Stout. If we jump ahead to number 28, Dimitri, the Mickalene Thomas. Of course, Mickalene Thomas's work has been seen at MOAD, has done an installation here in years past. Her mother's, as a subject for her, has been seen in a movie that she did in 2012 when her mother was dying, called Happy Birthday to a Beautiful Woman. And this is homage to her mother, who was a role model for her, someone who had worked in modeling and in the culture industry. And here she's presenting her mother as this nude odalisque-like figure, deliberately reminiscent of what we think about when we think about these photographs from the earlier part of modernism, even the early photographs of women in Egypt captured by Western photographers in nude or semi-nude presentations. And so this is what Thomas is doing. It's not the slide. She's giving you this chromogenic photograph that's supposed to look like an archival photo. The last thing I just want to show you, if we can go to the next slide, is a project done by a friend of mine named Adrian Childs called Rifts and Relations. It was an exhibition that was mounted at the Phillips Collection in Washington in 2020 and just closed, I think, last month. I mean, much of it is online, so go check out what it looks like. And, what Adrian did in this project is speak about the ways in which African-American artists, like we've seen with Ringgold especially, speak back to the European modernist tradition and transform it not only as an artistic challenge, because these are the figures that are like the 300-pound, counterweights. You can't go through them. You have to go around them and over them if you're an ambitious artist in North America coming out of art school, like Wiley did, like Mickalene Thomas did. So just to think about the ways in which this engagement is not something that goes away. Just to end up, if we could just jump to slide number 34. That's the Malik Sidibe slide. So skip past, yeah. I just want us to think about, in terms of defining diaspora, that oftentimes diaspora is seen as like a one-way path. That is to say that diaspora, in terms of African diaspora, is everything that comes from Africa and goes to the Americas and to Europe. And what I think is interesting about this photo done by Malik Sidibe, who did a lot of studio photography in his career, and then toward the latter part of the 20th century just became known not only for the studio photography, but the ways in which it spoke to a kind of modernity of African subjects in Mali and elsewhere, is that notice what the young people here are holding in terms of the object that unites them. It's this James Brown album. So there's ways in which we don't think about the influence of African Americans and people of African descent on things on the African continent that I hope we can sort of hold on to. And the very last thing is, do check out at Root Division here, and it'll be something in the next slide that you can see online, because I still think that they are closed. The Root Division Gallery is educational and display space here in art space here, devoted to teaching art to children and supporting artists in the Bay Area. And there's an exhibition called Diasporic Futurism Part 2 that opened just earlier this week, and that'll go through February 27th. And you can see the link that Dimitri is putting up there so they can learn more about this exhibition. Some of the artists are listed here, as well as they have an online, it'll be a virtual second Saturday on February 13 from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific. So this idea of diasporic and futurist tendencies coming together in some of the work of these contemporary artists are what you'll see here. So even though we didn't get to everything today, the very last slide is the one you'll see here in terms of some of the artists we talked to. We didn't talk about Nick Cave this week, but we will talk about him next week, and some of the key words here as we wind down this crash course. So thanks everybody for 2 hours of fun and great questions and conversations, and keep thinking about how am I gonna curate an exhibition on this subject matter. Can't wait to hear what you come up with. I love these comments. I feel so special. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jackie. See you next week.
See you next week, everybody. Take care. Be safe.